Welcome to Stoic Conversations. I'm Michael Tremblay.
And I'm Caleb Monteveros.
And today I'm going to do something, put myself out there a little bit. Today's episode is about my personal philosophy, how I think we should live, or at least I think I should live. I think it probably extends to all other people as well. I wanted to do this. I thought this would be a fun exercise to do because, as a historian of philosophy, spend so much time talking about what other people think, spend so much time interpreting Stoicism, writing about Stoicism, and that's obviously very valuable. But I wanted to take this some time to say, well, what do I really think? Where does that deviate from Stoicism? And where does it align? And I've got something here. I try to do it in real plain language. I try to make it as uncomplicated as possible. And I got something here that's a little bit different than Stoicism, but this is my first time really trying to do that exercise. It was very fun and wanted to share with you, Caleb, and everybody else listening.
Yeah, it's a good exercise. And I'd certainly say, in the broad sense, it's probably fair to describe both of us as Stoics. Maybe you disagree with that, but I would say the broad sense that's fairly accurate, especially, if you just know someone who knows a little bit about philosophy, but perhaps they're not in the weeds. I think that's fair, but very few people are doctrinaire Stoics. And of course, the Stoics disagreed amongst themselves, and perhaps many people, when we've talked about this as well, and say the modern Stoic movement might more accurately be described as Aristotelians in some sense. So all that's to say is, I think, even if one's, say, broadly Stoic, attracted to Stoicism, of course, there are going to be differences between Stoics, and people often reach out struggling with particular parts of Stoicism, or even saying, I'm attracted to the philosophy. It's been exceptionally useful for me, but I don't get this side of Stoicism, whether it's the physics or their approach to grief or what have you. And I think that's totally fair and is worth thinking through worth thinking through individually and together.
I think it's a good point. Just to reiterate what you said, Caleb, it's okay to learn about a philosophy, follow many parts of that philosophy, and still wrestle with some parts of them. I also think this comes back to that gatekeeping conversation we had a while ago. I think it's okay. We're all just trying to live the examined life. If you adopt this philosophical perspective, we're all in the pursuit of truth. I remember I mentioned in a podcast once that maybe I have some more Aristotelian leanings, which is not a statement that means anything to 99% of the population. If that is a relevant distinction for you, you're already pretty in deep the ancient philosophy game. And somebody online was like, "Oh, Michael's not a Stoic," and I was like, "This is strange. I don't think it." Anyway, I'm gonna say, call out some points I disagree with the Stoics, but it doesn't mean I agree with you that I would say I'm broadly Stoic aligned. 90% of the way there, just would not be a doctrinal Stoic in every aspect. And I always think a lot, Caleb, about one thing you said about, if you're debating a theory but it doesn't change how you live, is the theory that important? And I'll try to call out the spots where maybe I have a distinction that maybe impact a bit about how you should live, or make a bit of a difference about how you should live, and welcome you challenging those or, disagreeing as we go. I also, by way of context, I'm not sure how many people have read Spinoza's Ethics. Terribly confusing book. My PhD supervisor, he did Spinoza and the Stoics. That was his area of specialization. And I took a Spinoza class with him, and I was like, this is the guy to take it with. And it was good, but it was so challenging and confusing. But one thing I really like about Spinoza's Ethics is he used what's called the geometric method.
I can't say if that's what it's called. I think I know what you're talking about, but he has a list of Wittgenstein in his Tractatus does something similar, right?
It's basically a list of axioms, and then everything's kind of built off those. And I try to do that here. I'm going to start with kind of 3 axioms that I'm not going to argue, and then I try to build everything else off other things, off other arguments, and build up to these kind of practical implications. So I'll kick things off. I'll maybe do this one section at a time, and then we can jump in. So this is my attempt to articulate how people should live, my philosophy of life. First, I start with a broadly ancient eudaimonistic framework. So this view of life as being about flourishing. So Um, Premise one, some lives are objectively better than others. That's something that I believe. This is the kind of rejection of relativism or nihilism. I just think there are better or worse ways to live. And you can make true statements about those kinds of things. It's not like, well, that's just your opinion or nothing really matters anyway. No, my life can go better or worse. Even to have debate that is you're pretty deep in philosophy to kind of debate that, but that's something that I take as being true. Second, what defines a good life is determined by facts about our nature, what kind of thing we are, and how well we align with those facts. So this is an endorsement of teleology. And teleology is the view that things have a certain ends, certain purpose in some extent. And so first point is that lives can go better or worse. And then what determines whether your life goes better or worse is how well you live in accordance with or fulfill facts about what kind of thing you are. That's my second claim. And then my third claim is that aligning ourselves with our nature, so trying to live in accordance with those facts, is a craft. It's something we do, and like any other craft, it can be done more or less skillfully. So I can do a good job of building a life that fulfills my purpose or function, and I can do a bad job of that. And people have a variety of skills in that area. Those are my first three claims. Want me to keep going or jump in? What do you think is the best way?
I think that, well, maybe I'll just restate that in a different way, just to make sure I'm tracking along. I think I like the first premise. If you want to almost state these in a negative way, it's a rejection of what you could call relativism, subjectivism, nihilism, whatever. Just that some lives are better than others, objectively speaking. And then the second one would be it's a little bit harder to put in the negative way, but on the positive conception, it's that if you want to determine how to have a better life, then you look at the kind of thing you are and its nature. And so instead of perhaps, I would take that to be a rejection perhaps of utilitarianism or something like this, where you find values outside of whatever you are. Just there's like values floating around and you're trying to maximize them or achieve them. Like pleasure, it's linked up with our nature, and it's linked up with what you are as an individual, as opposed to perhaps some more different forms of life that might just say maximize pleasure. It doesn't really matter. Questions about who you are, what you are, doesn't really matter. And then the last one would be, you can be better or worse at achieving your nature. So it's in a way a kind of rejection of fatalism, I suppose, right? It's that you can live better. It's a craft. In a certain sense, you aren't just destined to be, something with a bad nature, something with a good nature, what have you.
Yeah, it's kind of like a rejection of this idea that some people are just born, bad at being humans, and some people are born at being good at being humans. And I don't think that's the case. There's this kind of affirmation of our agency in that.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that lands. So then some other things that come from these. So because living in accordance with nature our nature is a kind of a craft or a skill. Like any other craft or skill, we're able to train ourselves over time and dedicated practice to live more skillfully and therefore live better. I think this is maybe the same piece we were saying before. It's the real affirmation of agency. If this wasn't the case, then we would not have agency in living a good life. It's that kind of fatalism piece that you raised. Then another premise. So we've established this kind of agency to influence our lives, or at least I believe that. Now, because we can train ourselves to be better, to be more in accordance with our nature, and what makes a good life is how much we're in accordance with our nature. So then again, we have that significant agency over whether we achieve a good life or not. And then because we have that agency, this is premise number 6, the most important task in our lives, above any other passion or interest, is directing ourselves towards the project of living the best possible life. So this is a kind of Aristotelian argument, and I don't mean it's not an anti-Stoic argument. It's something Aristotle talks about in Nicomachean Ethics, which is that there's nothing we can want to pursue above having a good life. If we did that, it would be irrational. everything we do is in pursuit of a good life. So we have a degree of agency to do lots of things. If we have a degree of agency to live a good life, then everything else, that is the thing that it makes the most sense to dedicate our energy towards. That it makes the most sense to prioritize that above other things. Nothing else really could usurp that. That's claim number 6. Yeah. So that's
so
the
far,
eudaimonistic framework. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's just a eudaimonistic framework. Many of the Greco-Roman philosophies would be humming along to this.
Yeah, everybody's nodding. Nobody's throwing tomatoes yet. And then the next part, I think then we add in facts about human nature because we made all these claims. Like if I summarize the first part, it's like you can live a good life. It depends on what kind of thing you are, but you can do a better or worse job of becoming a good version of that kind of thing. The next question for me then is, what kind of thing are you? And so premise number 7, because a good life depends on what kind of thing we are, to succeed at our craft, we need to know our nature. And our nature is complex. We're not just one kind of thing. And I think that all of my breaking from the Stoics comes at this point. This claim that we are not just one kind of thing. We are a complex thing, or our nature is complex. Sorry, I have some people walking outside.
No worries. I can't hear it. Neighbors coming home.
Yeah. Our nature is complex. And I wish I had a better argument for it, but it just seems to me intuitively true. And I'll flesh it out a bit with these other premises. So premise 8, the most important part of our nature, I believe, is the rational part of ourselves, our prohairesis, our capacity for choice. I think that's part of who we are, part of what we are. And I think it's the most important part. But premise 9, contra the Stoics, we are by our essential nature also social creatures who live in bodies. We are not just our mind. We are not just our prohairesis. And that leads me to the last piece. So a good life has a hierarchy of goods. By far the most important is perfecting our reason and our choices. But extreme deprivation in other areas is actually bad for us. It's bad to be in solitary confinement. It's bad to live in extreme poverty. These bad circumstances, I agree with the Stoics, that because there's a hierarchy of good, these bad circumstances can sometimes be instrumentally good. So sometimes I could, be in solitary confinement, and that turns me towards a life of philosophy. And so I could take a -2 and get a +10. That's fine. I come out ahead. But that doesn't make them not bad. They're still kind of impeding or harming parts of my nature. Physical deprivation, social hardship, physical hardship in extreme manners. And I just think those things, I'm breaking with the Stoic axiology and value system by saying, I think those things are kind of bad. I think they're less bad than being a bad person, but I think they're kind of bad.
Yeah, so I suppose the central question for a lot of these life philosophies, especially the Greek and Roman ones, is, what is our nature then? And then your claim is that with the Stoics, you believe our prohairesis, our capacity for choice, is what's essential for living a good life. But it can also, part of our nature involves other things being good or bad for us than merely our, the decisions we make through life. So in a way, perhaps you might say something like someone may still be unhappy even if they're virtuous. I don't know if you'd make that claim in particular.
I don't think I have to go that far. Maybe I need to break this apart. Maybe the view is that I think it's necessary for a good life to be a good person.
Yeah.
It's probably sufficient. But all you have to do is introduce this idea of degrees of happiness, which the Stoics don't do, right? Like, yeah, is the sage on the torture rack happy? Yes. Is the sage at home with their loving family, surrounded by, eating a turkey dinner, happier? Yes. Because they have less of these bad things. So I think I kind of not that much different. Necessary and sufficient for happiness. And maybe I wouldn't say sufficient. Maybe I would say sufficient in, 99% of circumstances. And you can make these kind of thought experiments otherwise. But, you know, if you're kind of, chained up in a basement, does it really matter, how much you align your will with nature at that point? And I think even the Stoics acknowledge that about kind of, at that point, it's better to just stop eating and drinking and just kill yourself. So maybe I should thought a little bit more carefully about sufficiency and necessity of happiness. I think it's really, really important. I would say it's necessary. I don't think you can be happy without being a good person. I would say it's maybe sufficient, probably some extreme thought experiments where you could disprove that. But then I also introduced this idea of degrees of happiness. You can just be happier with more good things, and there's other good things besides your character.
Gotcha. So, I mean, it's very similar to the last view that we talked about in On Ends, where I believe the view by Antiochus is that a virtue is necessary and sufficient for a happy life, but as you say, you can have more or less happiness, which it sounds like is what you're saying.
Yeah, and then I try to get into here some of the practical, I would say that's accurate, yes. And then there's some practical implications of that. But any more on that part before I move forward?
Well, yeah, I definitely want to get to the practical implications because it's so similar. And I guess that's why we opened up saying we're maybe broadly Stoic, but perhaps maybe that we'll see whether that's overstating it or not.
Yeah. So let me get to the full implications of this, run through the rest of my premises. So I then say some agreements with the Stoics or some things that don't break with the Stoics here. So because the prohairesis is our most important part of ourselves, and it's, it's necessary. I certainly believe it's necessary and probably sufficient for a good life. Modern society vastly underestimates the importance of character for a good life and vastly overestimates the importance of physical goods and status. I think that part of a philosophical education is learning to turn your attention towards your character and turn your attention towards other mistaken conceptions of the good life that distract from, impede your pursuit of the good life, or in some ways are contradictory or conflict with the good life. Like the pursuit of money at the expense of being a good person, or the expense of showing your character to be a virtuous one. So that's an agreement with the Stoics. Because of that, I also think that because of that last idea that we overestimate the importance of physical goods and status, I think modern society vastly underestimates the amount of agency we have in improving our own lives and overestimates our fragility. And so this underestimation of our agency and this overestimation of our fragility, it leads to unnecessary stress, anxiety, anger, feelings of helplessness, and sadness. So a lot of our stress comes from thinking, I need something external to me to go a certain way to be happy. I need to get this thing. I need to own this thing. I need this person to like me. I need to date this person to be happy. And so we feel very fragile. We feel very stressed and anxious about our lives. Our character is very much up to us and we have high agency. And then because of the idea that there's this hierarchy of goods, it is possible, although not easy, to have a great life in terrible physical and social circumstances. You can be happy on the torture rack. So here, this is where I talked about sufficiency. You can be happy on the torture rack. It would just require a high degree of excellence, and you would be better off not on the rack. That's the part where I disagree with the Stoics. But the first part is that that agreement is that it's possible to have a great life in terrible circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that's certainly in a way more intuitive. Of course, like anything in philosophy, Stoicism can begin with these intuitive claims, and then you end up with the radical side of the philosophy. You just focus on what's under your control. You start with something intuitive like that, then end up with the idea that nothing matters at all but what's under your control, effectively. which is, or to be more precise, what nothing matters for your happiness, as it were. But of course, that cuts against other common sense ideas like, having a chronic illness isn't bad for you. Or I think just the intuitive sense that there are parts of life that are tragic, right? That does have and they involve misfortune. Life is not fair. They involve serious hardship, and it's perhaps the Stoic view doesn't fully acknowledge that. Of course, there are things Stoics can say, but I think that's a fair response, response to the Stoics, certainly.
When I get down to it, I take a step back. It's easy to say that this is an Aristotelian position. Well, that's one way to take it. Another step is it's kind of just a rejection of Stoic binary. I like the Stoics. They love that binary. You're either an idiot or you're a sage. You're either totally vicious or you're virtuous. You're either straight or you're bent. This is the way they would talk about things all the time. And it's a kind of a introduction. I think we get so much more if we just introduce this idea of degrees. There's degrees of progression. You can be a better or worse person without being a perfect one. There's degrees of happiness, even once you've achieved happiness. And, or even once you've achieved a good character. The person on the torture rack has less of a great life than the person who is just as virtuous, but is at home and, with their family and, comfortably fed and, supported, not on a torture rack. And so that's just a recognition of degrees. I think your point, which is like, there probably is a nuanced Stoic argument that shows the logical inconsistency of that. And once you introduce this idea of degrees, we probably lose something in the theory. But that's really it. And I'll get to that point. That's one of my last points, just this recognition of tragedy. I think is something. If the Stoics could just recognize some tragedy, without saying any sort of recognition of tragedy or sadness is ignorance, is for me a kind of, that's something I still wrestle with.
Yeah. Well, let's move on then to some of these disagreements, and then we can reflect on them.
Yeah. So here are my disagreements with the Stoics that come from this. So because of premise 9, which is that we are also social creatures who live in bodies, not everyone has the same degree of agency in pursuing a good character. So it's easier for nourished, socially supported people to learn about Stoicism and philosophy. I'm sure you can always have the anecdotal counter-argument about, the person who went through terrible things and it caused some sort of paradigm shift for them. But we talk a lot, Caleb, about Stoicism as this kind of craft. It requires attention, or requires focus. You just have more time for those things if you're better off. Now, being better off, there's obviously these counterexamples. Better off is not necessarily good for the development of your character. I agree with that Stoic premise. Having a life of luxury and leisure can turn you into the kind of person who feels dependent upon goods, or becomes a very shallow person, or becomes a very kind of greedy person. That's fine. But I just think it's all things considered. There's some circumstances where it's very hard to practice Stoicism. It's very hard to practice your attention. That's one disagreement I have. Another disagreement, which we've already hit on, is because we have bodies and are social creatures, extreme situations of social and physical hardship are bad. And I'm not talking about a mean boss or bully. I think it's useful to practice questioning our narratives about a conflict at work, for example. But terrible prison conditions, torture, extreme poverty, long-standing emotional abuse, these are bad things. These are things that harm us holistically as humans. They're contrary to our nature. Another thing that I believe, because of those last two things, we also have ethical obligations to help other people, both to eliminate the bad and to raise their agency to pursue life in accordance with their nature. So I think my view is more focused on the floor rather than the ceiling at this point. I think it's something like a capabilities approach. So we want to help people live fulsome lives where they have the capability and agency to build their character. And the capabilities approach, it's Nussbaum argues for this. My understanding, it's an approach to human welfare that focuses on the actual capabilities of humans to achieve a flourished life rather than, access to resources or legal rights. And the basic idea there is we want to promote people's capability to flourish. I should, if I have, additional money, if I have the additional capability to do this, I want to support people that are in too bad of a circumstance to flourish intellectually, to flourish in terms of their character. If they have their agency reduced by, as you said, by chronic illness, by extreme poverty, by being stuck in a situation of abuse, we have an obligation to help that. And then also because physical and social hardship is bad, and things can reduce our agency in pursuing a good life, it's appropriate to feel sad emotions sometimes. We can grieve as a recognition of the bad things that have happened to people. It's like anything else. It's about finding the middle ground or finding the correct time to apply those labels. We don't want to do that too often, but I think there are things that can happen that are sad, and that is not ignorance. And I'm fine with never achieving a stage of sagehood where I don't feel sad about, things that deserve it, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Overall, I think these, it's interesting you say it's just Aristotelianism. Well, it's a mix, I think, just like the view of Antiochus of some of the lines from the Stoics and traditional Aristotelianism, because I do think traditionally, or virtue is not sufficient for a good life.
Yeah. I would say,
maybe, I'm not an expert in Aristotle by any means, but go ahead.
There's some disagreement about whether or not character is sufficient. On some readings, they take it as sufficient. Some readings, some people take it as sufficient. But, if you think of Epictetus as kind of a cynical Stoic, then I think I'm like a stoical Aristotelian, or I'm an Aristotelian-y Stoic. It's like, if it's this long spectrum, I'm somewhere, I'm not fully Aristotelian, because I think I do take a harder line. And I think maybe that harder line comes from this like minimal state rather than this maximal state. Like Aristotle talks about, if you're a good person, it's better to be super, super rich, because then you can do even more super good things. And I think there's this kind of, maybe there's this view of just these kind of minimal conditions you need to have. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. I haven't thought about it in that way exactly. But I think if you think of it like a spectrum, it's somewhere in between those two. I'm not just like full Aristotelian. I think there's some points of emphasis the Stoics really get right.
Yeah, definitely. So 13 is sort of interesting. I feel like the 13, premise 13 from Tremblay, where he states, not everyone has the same degree of agency in pursuing a good character. That, I wonder if the Stoics would say, because they say things like, it's harder to be virtuous if you are, Musonius Rufus, who we just talked about, he says it's harder to be virtuous if you're exceptionally affluent. So, but he at the same time, they do want to say that everyone, in a sense, because they're rational, they have agency and they're responsible for their character. But nonetheless, it can be perhaps more difficult for some people, easier for others to be virtuous. And I think they're committed to that, at least Musonius Rufus is, when he says things like, it's better to be live this kind of life because it's more conducive for the life of virtue than this other kind of life. So I wonder how much they would disagree. I think they would disagree with the use of agency specifically, but would they disagree at the fundamental point of that? What do you think?
I think you're right that Musonius would. So yeah, I think you're correct that anybody who taught anybody Stoicism recognized that some people are better or worse at taking in the lessons depending on their life circumstances. Epictetus talks about this. Masonius Rufus talks about this. So there's a kind of a factual recognition. And then there's this kind of doctrine recognition. And I kind of struggle with this idea in Stoicism in general, which is this idea that, well, if virtue is good and I can stop you from achieving virtue, or I can limit can make it harder for you to achieve virtue, haven't I just harmed you in some way? And I think from a doctrine perspective, the Stoics have to reject that claim that somebody's been harmed, but I don't know how they reject that claim if they also admit that I've just made it harder for you to become a good person, which is goodness for you, right?
Yeah, I suppose they say you can't stop me from becoming virtuous, but you can make it more difficult. But that's that wouldn't be a harm. But then, yeah, maybe you'd say, yeah, I think then that doesn't bother me if they say that's not a harm. But I could see at the very least is decision relevant, which they would agree with too. You don't want to make it harder for people to be virtuous. And this connects to your later point. Perhaps that also means you want to make it easier for people to live a good life. That means you want to define some floor, perhaps, that people should meet and help them reach it.
That connects to the floor argument. I'm getting kind of consequentialist at this point. Does the Stoics' job become to maximize the amount of virtue across the world? I think I want to avoid the consequentialism. But I think in terms of if we are social creatures, what does my socialness compel me to do? Well, it compels me to help you in some way pursue your good life. Maybe not at the expense of my good life. Maybe I don't treat you as an equal. But if I have a sister, I want to help my sister have a good life. I don't want to help her do terrible things that harm herself, and I want to help her live a good life. And if I live in a society, which I do, I'm grounding kind of our social obligations in that idea that you can influence the quality of other people's lives, which I think this account gets us. Where I think the Stoics have a hard view of that, where they talk about fulfill your role, and then I feel maybe I just need to study more Stoicism, but I feel like you get into a bit of an infinite regress about, well, why does it matter if I'm a good brother, right? Why does it matter? What's kind of the grounding of that if I have no capacity to help or harm my sister,
Yeah. Well, they perhaps maybe one way to state it would be, or one way I'm thinking about it is, there are different levels, perhaps, of value. First, there's different, you can almost think of it as there's a binary, then there's a continuum. Maybe you wouldn't think about it this way, but you're living a happy life or you're not. And then there are happier lives once you've made it into the happy land. And then, of course, there's also the related idea that if you're not happy, there are less happy lives. You can be more or less unhappy. So the most important, perhaps, the focus on, when you talk about the focus being on capabilities or giving people the agency to live a good life, it's on making that first jump between unhappiness to happiness. And then once you've made it to living a happy life, perhaps, I don't want to say it's less important, but the focus on obligations becomes, if everyone lived a happy life, there wouldn't be such an obligation to make people, meet that bar, as it were. It would, perhaps your obligations look differently. Is that sort of how you're thinking about it, or is that a little askew?
That makes the first part made sense to me. I think we lost the second part, and I don't want this to necessarily descend into like Michael bangs his head against the concept of indifference again, which I feel like can happen once every 5 episodes or something. I think you're right that, or at least you hit on it, that the Stoics would say, well, just some things are preferable, like you prefer, you want to help your sister live the kind of life she prefers to live, which has facts about her physical nature and her social nature and things like this, or you want to help other people live preferable kind of lives, We just don't want to call them good lives because you can't help somebody live a good life because they've got to do that themselves. They've got to become a good person. I think that's kind of the Stoic play. And my play is just, no, I can help somebody become a good person. I can mentor them. I can teach them. I think Epictetus was helping people. I think he was enabling people to become more virtuous. I think he's helping people today in his writings. And I basically, when you open the door to the idea that I can make somebody unhappy, then I also open the door to I can make somebody happy. And then it pulls in a lot of common sense implications about recognizing tragedy and like what our social obligations to other people are. And I think if you pull those things in, you give that tiny little space in the Stoic theory, you lose some of the nice extremism of Stoicism. You lose those moments where Epictetus is like, well, whatever, chop off my head, but you'll never, impact my soul. You'll never control me. You lose some of that because now my worldview, it's kind of like, I really don't want you to chop off my head. That would be really bad, but it would be less bad than me, caving. It would be much less bad than me betraying my family. If that's the choice I'm given, I'll take that choice. You lose that to me is the much more commonsensical answer. And it has a bunch of common sense downstream implications, again, around that point of tragedy and around that point of helping other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. I suppose, one always can come back with the ideas of indifference, or perhaps thinking about, there's always a Stoic challenge to the other Greek philosophies in terms of, we found something that's good regardless of circumstance, namely virtue, this choice-worthy ability, but you're proposing that there are other goods, perhaps, but how do you explain that? How do you account for that in addition to the value of making excellent choices, in addition to the value of virtue? You've got whether it's health or some level of physical ability, social standing, whatever it is, what makes those things good in a way that's somehow disconnected from reason per hyresis. Yeah, does that make sense as a challenge?
Yeah, that's the Stoic. Like, I'm not doing something new here. Ancient schools were always trying to put other types of good on the table. And then what I was understanding your argument to be was that, why are these other goods so kind of like bad or worse or circumstantial? Is that what you meant at the end there?
Yeah, I suppose so. I think it's maybe it wasn't stated very well, so maybe I'll try again. But I think the Stoics case is strongest when they look at something like pleasure, and they'll say, yeah, intuitively pleasure is good. We like to experience pleasure rather than not. But then we'll think about, there's some pleasure that have no goodness in them at all, whether it's a pleasure of the sadist or even trivial pleasures that don't contribute to a life well lived at all. It's not just that, there is some amount of pleasure there and then they're usurped by the value of something else. It's that those things have no goodness in it. Therefore, pleasure itself can't be good. It's got to be something else, or at least there's got to be some other principle that explains the value of pleasure. And then they make that move for essentially all other things, all other possible values, and say, that's why what essentially matters is choice. Yeah, that pleasure is preferable, but what matters is how we use it. It's likewise wealth. Wealth is preferable, but we know that if someone's exceptionally wealthy, they can, in a real sense, ruin their life with that wealth. Someone who's poor can still live an excellent life. We talk about humans being a social creature, and it's certainly true that there are probably few harms worse than just absolute, social rejection or exile, being completely alienated from the people you love. But the Stoics, of course, explicitly say you can live well even in exile, and probably there are, we can think of cases where people were able to do that. So, and what grounds that? They're still able to make good choices with whatever they were given. And I think I suppose that's the Stoic line, which is maybe just a way to sort of expand that point of, these other things we think are good, they're not always good. Those other things we think are bad, they're not always bad. What matters is how we use them in the end. And that's, I guess, the common sense way to put the Stoic view.
My philosophy of Tremblayism here, I think, can account for all those anecdotes or all those situations. Going back to your example, so the example of the sadist, the person who gets pleasure, I think that is just what I'm saying is the thing that the Stoics reject is that person who gets pleasure from hurting somebody. It is a good thing that is then overruled by an abundance of a bad thing, and a bad thing much more bad. And so it's like, well, why, some people with pleasure can live bad lives. Some people that are exiled can live good lives. And it's like, yeah, because, I don't know. It's like you've got kind of 3 income streams or something. And like, if I get a lot of money from my main job, doesn't matter that my side hustle doesn't bring in any money. And if I get a little tiny amount of money from my side hustle at the expense of getting fired from my job, well, then that's probably a net bad thing. It's this kind of math we're doing. I guess it's that type difference between preferred and good that I'm suspicious that the Stoics make. And they make it on the grounds of identity. We are human, we are rational, so only reason is good. And then we're irrational things that happen to be in a body, so we prefer our body to be comfortable. And I guess I'm just like objecting to that. Can't you just have kind of 3? Can't all these things be good, but in vastly different degrees? And so, if I thought experimented this the other way, could you tell a little white lie or something? Could you do a little tiny minuscule bad thing to like, protect your body or your wealth or your, could the calculus sometimes go the other way? And I think it sometimes can. I think sometimes it's okay to do kind of bad things. Sometimes those trade-offs are in the table. Maybe that's where I go too far, because I want to talk about, I want to say that virtue is still necessary to be happy. But yeah, I guess my original point is why can't they just all be in the same category bucket? We're just talking about dollars versus cents here, right? Well, doesn't that just explain all the circumstances you raised?
Yeah, I think it definitely could. I suppose maybe the dollar, if you think about dollars and cents, then you think, well, everything's on the same scale, and that's easy to do with dollars. And perhaps also, if you're, say, a utilitarian and you think the only good thing is pleasure, then you can say, if I'm going to, all I want to do is maximize pleasure, minimize pain, I can just rank things by how pleasurable or painful they are. Of course, there are objections to that. Maybe you think you can't measure pleasure and pain that tightly, but at least in theory, you're sort of in a dollar and cents type world. But if you think, oh, there's pleasure, there's health, there's social standing, there's honor, there's aesthetic values. If you have sort of a list of objective goods, or maybe say our human nature is complex, we've got all these different things that can make a life go better or worse, then there is a question about, well, how do we make judgments between these? Maybe you can't. I think maybe there's just going to be some complexity, some uncertainty baked into your model of the world. That might be all right, but I think that is a kind of question for those views.
Yeah, I get your point. It's not all along the same spectrum. Yeah. And so I did want to, well, it could be along the same spectrum, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, I guess, is the point. Yeah. So anything else zooming out to a high level? Because I'll just continue to fight against this preferred indifference versus good but much less good question. I think my break, if I had to summarize this, it was look. I think the radical that we are just that we are a rational thing. Um, and so other stuff isn't good or bad because of that. I make a break there. I'm still really on the Stoic ends of things, but I make a break there, and I think it allows a lot of the goods of Stoicism. So we should continue. We overestimate the importance of physical goods and status in modern society. We underestimate our agency and we overestimate our fragility, which leads to stress, anxiety, anger, and feelings of helplessness. It's possible to have a great life, even in terrible physical circumstances and social circumstances. Those are a lot of the benefits of Stoicism, and I believe those to be true. But then I think we just get a couple more common sense. I think this break smuggles in a couple more common sense. It's like we're smuggling in some of the good at a minimum amount of bad. And I think it makes more sense. It's more compelling to me, which is that some extreme situations, you can call bad some extreme situations. Some things stop people's ability to pursue a good life or limit or impede it. And we have a kind of obligation to like raise people to a certain floor of agency so they can pursue philosophy, so they can pursue these questions of the examined life. And hard to do that if somebody's, if an 11-year-old starving to death, it's hard for them to do that. Or if somebody doesn't have access to a basic education or, is in a kind of abusive situation, they don't really have the capacity to do that. And then some things are just kind of sad sometimes, and that's okay. They shouldn't ruin your life. They're not tragedies that should be long-term passions, but there's some things that are kind of sad. And that's where I stand. Part of the reason we do this work is to, update those views, change those views. This view is obviously heavily influenced by the Stoicism I've studied and read. Maybe it will change as I continue to study more. Maybe it'll become more nuanced. But yeah, that's where I'm sitting right now. And it was a fun exercise. I would encourage other people to do it as well. It's fun to kind of put your money where your mouth is and, really clarify what you believe.
Yeah, definitely a good exercise. I like how you highlight the question of our nature and how some of these practical upshots follow from that question. Certainly, I think it does seem like just saying we're simply rational animals is perhaps too reductive in a way. Of course, you want to say saying we're rational is too reductive. We're rational animals, as you say, we're social, we have a body. And although the Stoics think everything's a body, in many senses, they perhaps underrate just being a physical organism. That's not essential to, or at least ordinary common sense ideas about what it would take for an organism to live a good life, or they reject. So it's really with that premise, number 7, where I think a lot of the divergence begins, or you could say the divergence and the agreement, that emphasis on reason, but also this idea that there are other aspects of our nature that determine how we live.
No, awesome. Well summarized. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for doing this. All right. Let us know what you think, y'all. And maybe perhaps we'll do another one of these when you've changed your mind in a few years.
Yeah. I'm interested if people agree or disagree. Yeah, and then we'll see how things change in a couple of years. Totally. Thanks, Gil.
Cool.